When the public imagines a violent kidnapping, they almost always picture a highly chaotic physical crime. The threats were transmitted directly and silently through the digital ether, landing squarely in the electronic. They demanded the massive Bitcoin transfer, but aggressively refused to offer a single shred of concrete evidence that Nancy was actually still alive and safely within their physical control. This highly suspicious, absolute refusal to provide a simple photograph or a brief audio recording drastically altered the entire psychological profile of the anonymous suspects. It forced the deeply frustrated federal agents to actively consider a truly terrifying alternative reality regarding the entire massive extortion plot. The total absence of living proof strongly suggested that the aggressive digital negotiators completely lacked the physical ability to actually produce the elderly victim. While the highly trained federal cyber units desperately fought to trace the complex encrypted emails, a completely separate, specialized forensic medical team was quietly uncovering a deeply horrifying, absolute truth hidden entirely inside a massive database. They had formally subpoenaed the highly secure medical servers that continuously monitored the internal biological data transmitted by the implanted cardiac device. The specialized forensic technicians meticulously scrolled back through the massive, endless columns of complex physiological data, desperately searching for any slight indication of life after the violent abduction occurred. Inbox of Harvey Levin at the prominent media outlet TMZ, according to multiple independent media reports. They specifically zeroed in on the exact chronological timeline of the incredibly chaotic early morning hours of February 1st. The complex mathematical data presented a perfectly clear, entirely indisputable, and incredibly devastating narrative of the exact events. The internal medical logs definitively showed that the implanted pacemaker completely and permanently ceased transmitting any vital biological signals at exactly 2:28 in the morning. The continuous digital tether connecting the beating human heart to the outside medical network was abruptly and violently severed forever in the deep darkness of the desert night. The cold, uncompromising medical data absolutely confirmed that the biological machine had completely stopped functioning mere hours after the initial home invasion originally took place. The aggressive, anonymous individuals sending the terrifying demands to TMZ and the local television stations were actively and aggressively negotiating for the safe return of a human life that had mathematically ceased to exist days earlier. They were ruthlessly utilizing the deep, agonizing emotional pain of a terrified family to aggressively extort massive amounts of money while fully knowing they could never actually hold up their end of the terrifying bargain. This immediate shift from a local residential crime scene to a national digital broadcast completely altered the fundamental nature of the entire investigation. The highly sophisticated digital extortion campaign was nothing more than a deeply cruel, completely empty financial illusion built entirely on top of a massive, tragic physical loss. Hit the like button if you think the FBI was dealing with a ghost at this point, because the digital forensics are about to get much darker. The realization that the federal agents were actively trying to negotiate a massive financial settlement with an entirely phantom hostage completely shattered the existing operational parameters of the entire federal investigation. The complex case officially transitioned from a frantic, desperate rescue mission into a highly calculated, incredibly dark digital murder investigation. The absolute realization that the victim had expired just hours after the initial abduction completely shattered the traditional law enforcement approach to the complex physical crime scene. The seasoned federal investigators immediately recognized that entirely relying on standard physical forensics would ultimately result in total failure. The complete absence of a tangible paper ransom note left behind at the secluded property meant the massive forensic laboratory had absolutely zero traditional physical evidence to actively process. The highly trained forensic technicians could absolutely not extract a single microscopic skin cell isolate. The unknown perpetrators did not want to negotiate quietly with a terrified family in the dark shadows. A stray drop of human saliva, or identify a partial latent fingerprint from an entirely digital communication. The complete lack of physical paper meant the suspect had completely successfully insulated themselves from the entire massive database of biological genetic markers. The federal task force was forcefully compelled to immediately pivot their entire massive operational strategy and deeply immerse themselves entirely into the cold, highly complex environment of advanced digital forensics and sophisticated cyber tracking. The elite investigative team immediately deployed highly specialized linguistic experts to aggressively analyze the specific, intricate vocabulary, the unique grammatical structures, and the distinct phrasing utilized entirely throughout the threatening encrypted emails. This highly advanced, specialized field of forensic linguistics actively seeks to identify the unique, invisible digital fingerprint hidden entirely within the specific written syntax of the unknown author. The linguistic analysts meticulously mapped out every single specific word choice, desperately searching for any hidden regional dialects, unique educational markers, or specific cultural idioms that could definitively point toward a highly specific geographic location or a distinct demographic profile. They wanted a massive public spectacle, and they aggressively used highly secure email servers to launch their campaign of psychological terror. Simultaneously, a completely separate elite team of federal cyber analysts launched a massive, aggressive, highly coordinated attack directly against the complex technical infrastructure actively hiding the anonymous perpetrators. They aggressively pursued the highly obscured metadata deeply embedded within the complex digital headers of the threatening electronic communications. They relentlessly tracked the bouncing, invisible internet protocol addresses as the complex digital signals rapidly zigzagged wildly across dozens of highly secure international servers, actively attempting to violently mask their true original geographic physical location. Furthermore, the highly specialized Federal Financial Crimes Unit aggressively locked onto the specific complex alphanumeric cryptocurrency wallet addresses actively provided by the digital extortionists. They immediately deployed highly sophisticated blockchain analytical tracking software to continuously comprehensively monitor every single digital movement on the massive decentralized financial ledger. The elite financial agents were actively waiting for the incredibly arrogant suspects to make a single tiny microscopic mistake by attempting to actively transfer or successfully convert the massive demanded funds into traditional, usable physical currency. They patiently, meticulously mapped the deeply complex digital pathways, heavily relying entirely on the absolute. This complete lack of physical documentation presented a massive immediate hurdle for the responding federal forensic units. Mathematical certainty that the massive global electronic financial network never truly forgets a single transaction. The federal agents were forcefully utilizing the exact same highly advanced digital technology that initially enabled the massive, cruel extortion plot to actively, rapidly hunt down the completely invisible perpetrators hiding in the dark. However, as the elite, highly trained cyber investigators pushed aggressively deeper into the massive, endless ocean of complex, encrypted data, a deeply confusing, entirely massive contradiction rapidly began to emerge from the endless analytical reports. The highly complex, completely pristine digital crime scene began to violently, directly contradict the highly chaotic initial reports generated entirely by the physical crime scene. The terrifying encrypted emails sent aggressively to the local media stations explicitly, heavily detailed, highly specific, massive, violent physical damage allegedly occurring entirely inside the secluded private residence during the violent, terrifying abduction. But the incredibly experienced local police officers who were physically present and who initially, carefully, completely, thoroughly processed the physical home absolutely, definitively confirmed that the interior environment presented absolutely zero clear, obvious, immediate signs of a massive, violent, desperate physical struggle. How exactly does the Federal Bureau of Investigation begin to properly process and thoroughly? The physical environment simply did not match the massive, terrifying digital narrative actively, aggressively presented by the unknown, arrogant extortionists. The physical house was completely, perfectly, completely pristine, while the digital emails heavily, explicitly described a totally, violently, completely chaotic, violent, incredibly destructive, massive home invasion. The brilliant, highly trained federal analysts were suddenly, painfully, forcefully, directly confronted with a deeply, massive, incredibly confusing, fundamental, basic investigative problem. The cold, hard physical reality completely, violently clashed directly with the highly structured, carefully presented digital narrative. This massive, glaring contradiction directly forced the elite federal task force to abruptly, aggressively, permanently halt their entire massive, rapid forward digital momentum and fundamentally, completely, entirely reconsider every single piece of complex digital evidence they had actively, aggressively gathered so far. The profound, massive digital mystery was rapidly, completely, quickly becoming exponentially, significantly darker and infinitely, significantly, vastly more incredibly, terrifyingly complex than anyone had originally ever initially potentially believed. The glaring inconsistency between the undisturbed physical environment and the violently descriptive electronic messages introduced a paralyzing new theory into the already complex federal investigation. If the anonymous authors behind the threatening communications possessed such incredibly detailed knowledge about the interior of the residence, why analyze a critical piece of physical evidence that simply does not exist in the tangible real world? Did their aggressive descriptions of property damage completely fail to match the pristine reality documented by the initial responding officers? This profound discrepancy forced the specialized behavioral science units to actively confront a deeply disturbing alternative hypothesis regarding the true identity of the individuals demanding the massive cryptocurrency payment. The seasoned criminal profilers began to seriously question whether the aggressive digital negotiators were actually the precise individuals who physically entered the suburban home that quiet night. The investigators had to actively consider the terrifying possibility that they were dealing with two entirely separate criminal entities operating simultaneously. The first entity was the highly disciplined physical predator who silently extracted the elderly victim without leaving a single trace. The second entity was a completely detached group of opportunistic digital scavengers. In the modern landscape of high-profile true crime tragedies, highly organized rings of international network scammers routinely monitor local emergency scanners and scrape preliminary police reports leaked to the public press. These incredibly ruthless opportunists actively weaponize this fragmented information to quickly construct highly convincing fraudulent extortion campaigns. They absolutely cannot dust an encrypted email for latent human fingerprints. They deliberately target the profound vulnerability of desperate relatives seeking any possible avenue to rescue their missing loved ones. The federal agents had to critically evaluate whether the incredibly specific details regarding the stolen clothing and the alleged interior damage were actually gathered firsthand by the kidnappers or merely scraped from unsecured early law enforcement communications by completely unrelated cyber criminals. This agonizing investigative crossroad created an absolutely immense psychological burden for the grieving relatives. The prominent television anchor who had bravely issued the initial public pleas for compassion was now being forcefully subjected to a horrific form of psychological torture. She was compelled to sit in quiet rooms and meticulously read through the extremely graphic, disturbing electronic letters forwarded by the federal authorities. She had to carefully analyze the cruel, manipulative text, desperately searching for any authentic, linguistic rhythm or familiar phrase that might definitively prove the anonymous authors actually held her mother captive. The profound emotional devastation of reading those terrifying demands was massively amplified by the horrifying uncertainty of their true origin. The Federal Command Center was suddenly thrust into an incredibly dangerous high-stakes gamble involving finite specialized resources. They cannot extract microscopic DNA samples from a digital internet server log. If the elite cyber tracking units continued to pour their massive technical capabilities into aggressively tracing the bouncing internet protocol addresses, associated with the threatening emails. They risked wasting invaluable days chasing a completely disconnected group of overseas financial scammers. However, if the investigative directors actively decided to completely dismiss the digital communications as a cruel, opportunistic hoax, they risked ignoring the only potential active communication channel directly linked to the actual physical kidnappers. The specialized task force was essentially flying blind through a massive digital storm. They desperately needed a singular, undeniable piece of forensic evidence to definitively connect the anonymous internet voices back to the silent, physical reality of the empty house. The entire sprawling federal operation was temporarily paralyzed by this profound informational fracture. The authorities were caught in a deeply frustrating, agonizing holding pattern, waiting for the unseen perpetrators to either make a critical technical mistake or finally provide a verifiable piece of information that could completely validate their terrifying claims. What does the evidence tell you? Are these the real kidnappers or opportunistic scammers? Drop your theory in the comments. Seen with a hastily written ransom note left behind on a kitchen counter or pinned to a front door. If you want to examine more forensic breakdowns and raw evidence like this, hit subscribe and step deeper into the Ellis evidence room. The incredibly agonizing wait for absolute certainty took a massive toll on the dedicated professionals working the case around the clock. Every single passing hour without a definitive technical breakthrough allowed the digital trail to grow increasingly colder and significantly more obscured by layers of advanced encryption. The specialized cyber analysts aggressively combed through the massive architecture of the dark web, searching for any hidden chatter or illicit marketplace transactions that might independently verify the true source of the extortion demands. They meticulously cross-referenced the unique digital signatures of the current emails against massive historical federal databases containing thousands of known fraudulent ransom campaigns. The investigators were desperately hunting for a recognizable pattern, a familiar coding error, or a distinct grammatical footprint that could definitively identify the unseen adversaries as either genuine violent threats or mere opportunistic digital parasites. The profound, terrifying ambiguity of the entire situation represented the absolute worst possible scenario for the desperate family and the intensely focused investigators alike. The tension was incredibly unbearable. The unbearable tension of the holding pattern finally broke in late March of 2026, when an entirely unprecedented development completely shattered the stagnant investigation. The investigators were forcefully compelled to completely abandon their traditional physical forensic in the highly predictable traditional script of violent criminal extortion. The perpetrators usually escalate their aggressive threats or simply vanish entirely into the digital shadows when their massive financial demands remain completely unmet. But this specific case violently deviated from every single established behavioral precedent. A completely new electronic communication suddenly arrived at the prominent media outlets, but the fundamental nature of this specific message was shockingly different. It was absolutely not another aggressive demand for millions in untraceable cryptocurrency. It was instead categorized by the stunned federal investigators as a formal digital apology letter. The anonymous authors, who had previously projected an aura of absolute terrifying control, suddenly offered a deeply chilling, unsolicited admission of catastrophic failure. The text explicitly claimed that the individuals responsible for the sudden home invasion had absolutely failed to properly anticipate the incredibly fragile medical condition of their elderly target. The chilling electronic message coldly stated that the violent physical stress of the initial extraction had overwhelmed toolkits, and immediately dive into the incredibly complex and highly encrypted world of global network data, her system, and that she had subsequently went to be with the Lord shortly after being removed from the suburban residence. This horrific digital confession hit the federal command center like a massive seismic shockwave. The sudden pivot from aggressive financial extortion to a bizarre form of anonymous remorse was incredibly jarring and completely contradicted standard criminal profiling models. But the true immense power of this final electronic message did not lie in its twisted attempt at offering an apology. The absolute devastating significance of the digital letter was rooted in how perfectly its macabre narrative aligned with the previously discovered hidden medical evidence. The federal agents immediately cross-referenced the chilling claims contained within the new email against the pristine silent logs pulled from the implanted cardiac device. The deeply disturbing correlation was absolute and mathematically undeniable. The internal medical machine had definitively recorded a complete permanent cessation of all vital biological activity at precisely 2:28 in the early morning. The anonymous authors of the sudden apology letter were actively confessing to a tragic timeline that perfectly mirrored the exact hidden forensic data. This terrifying synchronization completely resolved the massive, paralyzing dilemma that had previously plagued the entire specialized task force. They had to somehow precisely trace an invisible electronic shadow moving rapidly through a massive global communications network without leaving a single footprint behind. The people sending the encrypted emails were absolutely not a disconnected group of overseas opportunists scraping random details from the public press. They possessed the exact highly guarded chronological truth regarding the precise moment the victim actually expired. They knew this highly specific information because they were directly physically present when the tragedy occurred. The sudden arrival of the morbid apology letter completely validated the digital communications as a direct, authentic link to the true perpetrators. It also finally provided a thoroughly logical, horrifying explanation for the absolute absence of any verifiable proof of life during the aggressive initial negotiation phase. The kidnappers could never produce a current photograph or a fresh audio recording because their captive had tragically succumbed to the overwhelming physical trauma within mere hours of the initial abduction. The entire elaborate, aggressive campaign, demanding massive amounts of digital currency, was a profoundly cruel, completely deceptive performance. The anonymous perpetrators were ruthlessly attempting to aggressively monetize a fatal operational error. They knowingly strung the terrified relatives along for weeks, aggressively demanding an absolute fortune in exchange for a safe return they knew was physically and permanently impossible. To fully comprehend the terrifying digital reality of this specific case, we must first examine a microscopic piece of technology hidden entirely out of plain sight. The stunning revelation completely reframed the entire context of the sprawling investigation. The federal agents were no longer hunting for individuals holding a live hostage in a hidden, secure location. They were actively pursuing a highly dangerous group of individuals who had successfully executed a flawless physical extraction, subsequently caused the immediate death of their vulnerable target, and then orchestrated a massive, highly sophisticated psychological terror campaign to hide their ultimate failure. The deeply disturbing alignment of the electronic apology letter and the internal cardiac data provided the absolute defining moment of the entire federal inquiry. The investigators finally possessed a perfectly clear, completely verified understanding of the exact sequence of tragic events. The profound mystery of the missing elderly woman was tragically resolved not by the traditional discovery of a physical location, but by the cold, cruel intersection of a massive external network transmission and a tiny internal medical sensor. Hit the subscribe button if this shocking forensic alignment completely changed your entire perspective on this case. The complete confirmation of the timeline allowed the dedicated, specialized teams to aggressively refocus their long before the chaotic events of early February 2026. The 84-year-old mother of television anchor, massive technical resources with a renewed sense of absolute clarity and incredibly intense determination. The invisible digital ghosts had finally revealed their true terrifying nature, and the relentless pursuit was about to enter its final, highly aggressive phase. The absolute validation of the digital communications fundamentally, completely altered the remaining trajectory of the massive investigation. The highly experienced federal agents no longer had to second-guess the true origin of the complex encrypted data streams. They could finally proceed with the absolute concrete certainty that the complex alphanumeric wallet addresses and the deeply hidden routing metadata belonged entirely to the exact individuals responsible for the tragic disappearance. The entire specialized task force immediately initiated a massive, comprehensive re-examination of every single previously collected digital artifact, specifically utilizing the chilling new context provided by the final morbid confession. The highly trained forensic accountants and specialized cyber analysts aggressively constructed a massive, highly detailed digital map, specifically designed to trace the exact hidden movements of the anonymous perpetrators across the completely decentralized financial architecture. Savannah Guthrie relied on a highly sophisticated internal medical device to simply maintain her daily existence. Every single tiny fragmented piece of electronic data was meticulously, continuously threaded together to slowly form a highly visible, terrifyingly clear, comprehensive portrait of a massive, sophisticated criminal enterprise. The deep, complex investigation that had originally started with an entirely empty, undisturbed physical house in the wealthy foothills had seamlessly, successfully transformed into an incredibly massive, relentless digital manhunt spanning across an infinite global network. The highly skilled investigators meticulously utilized the advanced technical intelligence to slowly, aggressively tighten the invisible electronic noose directly around the hidden adversaries. They carefully monitored the absolute silent flow of data, actively waiting for the precise, exact moment when the arrogant criminals would eventually make a single fatal technical error that would instantly expose their true physical coordinates to the waiting authorities. The massive, agonizing burden of uncertainty that had severely tortured the desperate family for so many dark weeks was finally, permanently, completely lifted, but the ultimate devastating truth, it was rapidly replaced by offered absolutely zero true emotional comfort. The relatives were forcefully, painfully compelled to fully accept the terrifying absolute reality. Nancy Guthrie lived with an implanted cardiac pacemaker, that their beloved mother was never actually coming back to the quiet, beautiful house in the desert. The profound, deeply painful grieving process could finally, officially, formally begin. But it was permanently, heavily tainted by the horrific, highly cruel, deceptive nature of the entire massive digital extortion plot. The criminals had aggressively, callously utilized the sacred, profound hope of a loving, desperate family as a completely disposable, highly manipulative, transactional tool. The complex forensic narrative was finally completely mathematically resolved, but the absolute most vital, fundamental question of the entire tragedy remained completely, agonizingly, entirely unanswered. The brilliant, massive, highly advanced digital footprint had successfully, flawlessly mapped out the exact psychological profile and the precise, complex financial movements of the dangerous anonymous suspects. The highly trained federal agents possessed the incredible, immense technical capability to successfully track a completely invisible internet protocol addressed straight directly back to a specific physical hardware device located somewhere out there in the vast real world. They possessed the absolute, incredible, profound power to successfully, completely, fully identify the exact specific individuals actively sitting directly behind the glowing computer screens, aggressively demanding the massive, untraceable ransom. Most people view a pacemaker strictly as a miraculous, life-saving medical tool designed to artificially regulate a struggling human heart. But all the massive, incredible computational power and all the brilliant, highly advanced, specialized cyber intelligence in the entire federal government absolutely, completely, entirely lacked the fundamental ability to successfully, completely, properly locate the actual physical remains of the innocent victim. The completely pristine physical house was entirely empty, and the massive, sprawling digital landscape ultimately offered absolutely zero true physical closure. The brilliant, specialized analysts could easily follow the highly complex, completely hidden digital money trail. But the complex, advanced mathematical data completely fundamentally stopped, right? Exactly at the cold, hard edge of the vast physical desert. The ultimate, deeply tragic, massive irony of the entire complex case is that the highly advanced electronic technology successfully, flawlessly managed to properly, perfectly solve the complex hidden crime while completely, entirely, fundamentally failing to successfully, properly bring the actual physical victim completely back home to her grieving family. The silent physical location of her final permanent resting place remains a profound, agonizing, total mystery. The dedicated law enforcement professionals must continue to aggressively search the physical terrain, hoping to finally discover the absolute final hidden piece of this puzzle. This highly disturbing, complex case provides an incredibly vital, terrifying lesson regarding the fundamental, but from a strict forensic perspective, a modern pacemaker is something entirely different and incredibly powerful. Absolute necessity of demanding verifiable proof of life during any massive modern extortion event. In our incredibly advanced contemporary digital age, highly sensitive personal information is constantly routinely scraped, illegally harvested, and aggressively traded across massive, hidden, illicit network marketplaces. A completely anonymous individual describing specific, accurate details about a private home or specific clothing absolutely no longer serves as definitive, concrete proof of actual physical possession of a targeted victim. The highly complex forensic analysis clearly, explicitly demonstrates that the complete, utter refusal to provide a current, authentic photograph or a fresh, verified audio recording must always be immediately treated as the absolute, ultimate red flag by all responding authorities. It fundamentally, immediately reroutes the entire massive strategic direction of the complex high-stakes negotiation process away from a desperate, frantic rescue operation and directly toward a highly focused, complex homicide investigation. What this specific chilling case teaches us about the rapid, terrifying evolution of violent criminal extortion is absolutely profound and completely, deeply unsettling. We have completely, definitively crossed a massive, permanent historical threshold in complex, modern criminal behavior. We have been entirely conditioned by decades of high-profile cases to expect a tangible piece of paper. It is essentially an indestructible, internal, digital black box. The traditional physical crime scene is absolutely no longer strictly confined to a highly visible physical room or a distinct bloody location in the physical world. The true, highly complex active crime scene now exists entirely silently within the deeply hidden, highly encrypted data logs of an internal medical device, and completely hidden across the massive decentralized architecture of a global cryptocurrency network. The most incredibly critical, highly vital forensic evidence is absolutely no longer something a trained detective can ever physically hold directly in their hands. The absolute truth must be actively, aggressively, meticulously, completely, mathematically decoded from the massive, endless, silent flow of invisible digital network information. The terrifying, complex journey from an anonymous, encrypted email sent to a national media outlet to a digital homicide investigation represents a massive paradigm shift in modern forensic science. The exhaustive analysis of the electronic threats and cruel digital demands has successfully established a highly visible electronic trail pointing straight back into the deep shadows. The highly intricate federal dossier detailing every microscopic electronic movement made by the suspects has been perfectly finalized and securely archived by the elite investigative teams. The highly advanced cyber experts have fully accomplished their incredibly difficult technical mission by completely unmasking the terrifying electronic ghosts. It constantly and silently records an immense amount of highly specific biological data. But the final, ultimate, deeply chilling phase of this unprecedented true crime story is just now finally beginning to actively unfold in the real physical world. When the heavily armed federal tactical teams finally utilize this perfect digital map to forcefully knock down a physical door somewhere, exactly who will they find waiting silently on the other side? The digital trail in this case is still actively unfolding. Hit subscribe to the Ellis Evidence Room so you absolutely do not miss the next massive forensic update. See you in the next incredibly complex case file. It logs every single electrical pulse, every minor fluctuation in cardiac rhythm, and every exact moment of physical exertion. It transmits this deeply intimate biological information directly to secure medical servers, acting as a continuous digital tether between a living human body and the outside network. The device is entirely designed to monitor life, but it is equally capable of recording the exact, precise moment that life is violently interrupted. This silent internal machine operates completely independent of human emotion or deceptive manipulation. It simply records the absolute mathematical truth of the human heart it is attached to. During the quiet evening hours of January 31st, 2026, the internal digital logs showed a perfectly normal and entirely stable cardiac rhythm. Nancy was resting safely within the comfortable, familiar walls of her home in the Catalina foothills. The complex electronic device, pulsing quietly in her chest, was completely unaware that its containing terrifying demands constructed from magazine clippings or scrawled in hurried handwriting, stream of routine medical data was rapidly approaching a terrifying and abrupt conclusion. The internal machine dutifully recorded her normal evening activities, measuring the gentle rise and fall of her resting heart rate as she moved through her secure suburban environment. There was absolutely no indication of stress, no sudden spikes in adrenaline, and no erratic electrical signals that would suggest any form of physical distress or immediate danger. The highly advanced medical technology painted a perfectly serene picture of an elderly woman enjoying a peaceful, undisturbed night in her own private sanctuary. The complex network of digital sensors and external medical monitoring servers registered nothing more than the quiet biological hum of a life completely at rest. The family members who loved her deeply had absolutely no logical reason to suspect that this peaceful biological rhythm was about to be violently and permanently shattered. The digital tether connecting her heart to the outside world remained perfectly strong and steady as the dark desert night deepened around her isolated property. The internal machine simply continued to count the beats, completely blind to the fact that the external world was actively conspiring to end them. But when investigators arrived at the secluded Catalina foothills residence in the early hours of the investigation, they found absolutely nothing of the sort. When the new day eventually dawned, the steady flow of biological data would become the absolute most crucial and deeply chilling piece of forensic evidence in the entire federal investigation. The device that was surgically implanted to preserve her life was destined to become the silent, uncompromising digital witness to her sudden disappearance. The investigators who would soon examine this highly sensitive medical information could never have anticipated the deeply disturbing story the digital numbers would eventually tell. The peaceful, continuous data stream flowing seamlessly throughout the late evening hours stood in horrifying, sharp contrast to the absolute terrifying digital silence that was rapidly and inevitably approaching in the darkness. The profound silence of the deserted house was only the very beginning of a deeply traumatizing public nightmare. In early February 2026, the terrifying reality that Nancy was entirely missing from her home crashed down upon her family with an incredibly devastating force. The highly disturbing absence of an 84-year-old woman quickly escalated from a frantic private family search into a massive, highly publicized national news event. Her daughter Savannah utilized her prominent national media platform to publicly and desperately beg the unknown individuals responsible to safely return her vulnerable mother. There was no physical letter waiting for them on the dining table. The deeply emotional public pleas, broadcasted across the entire country, were intended to appeal to the basic human conscience of the perpetrators. But the individuals controlling the terrifying situation absolutely did not respond with any degree of human compassion or private negotiation. Instead, they chose to aggressively escalate the psychological warfare by launching a highly coordinated digital extortion campaign directly targeting the prominent media landscape. Anonymous electronic emails began aggressively flooding into the highly secure digital inboxes of local television stations like Cold and prominent national gossip platforms like TMZ. These digital communications were absolutely not the frantic, disorganized ramblings of a panicked criminal on the run. They were coldly calculated, highly structured electronic documents demanding an absolutely massive financial payout in completely untraceable Bitcoin. The unknown senders aggressively utilized the sheer speed and absolute anonymity of the internet to completely bypass traditional law enforcement communication channels. They wanted the sheer terror to be highly visible and completely public. What made these specific encrypted emails so incredibly terrifying to the seasoned investigators was the extremely precise nature of the internal information they contained. The anonymous digital authors were not just making vague, generalized threats from a distance. There was no desperate message left behind on the walls. The text inside the messages contained highly specific, entirely accurate details regarding the exact clothing Nancy was wearing on the specific night she vanished into the darkness. Furthermore, the emails actively described highly specific physical damage located entirely inside the private residence. These were extremely sensitive, critical details that had absolutely not been released to the general public or the local press. The inclusion of this highly accurate private information forcefully proved to the terrified family and the deeply concerned federal agents that the anonymous individuals sending the hostile emails had definitive, direct, intimate knowledge of the actual physical crime scene. They possess the exact highly guarded facts that only the true perpetrators or someone standing directly inside the house could possibly know. This completely shifted the entire operational focus of the local authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately assumed full command of the sprawling complex case, recognizing that this was a highly sophisticated, multi-jurisdictional cyber extortion plot layered directly on top of a violent physical abduction, the elite federal agents quickly began aggressively dissecting every single line of code within the threatening digital messages. The physical environment was completely devoid of the traditional communication methods utilized by kidnappers. They rigorously analyzed the hidden routing data, the complex server relays, and the highly sophisticated encryption methods actively utilized by the anonymous senders. But as the deeply experienced technical forensic analysts meticulously tore apart the complex digital architecture of the terrifying emails, they quickly discovered a deeply troubling and highly confusing anomaly hidden entirely within the cold electronic text. The aggressive individuals demanding the massive millions in untraceable cryptocurrency were incredibly eager to forcefully prove their intimate knowledge of the damaged house and the stolen clothing. They aggressively detailed the environment to establish their terrifying authority and total control over the situation. But amid all the aggressive digital posturing and the massive financial demands, there was one absolutely massive, glaring omission that immediately sent a very cold shiver down the spine of every single federal agent assigned to the complex case. The anonymous senders were aggressively demanding a massive fortune in exchange for a human life. But when the highly trained federal negotiators carefully analyzed the text, they realized the digital kidnappers were completely avoiding the most fundamental, basic rule of any high-stakes hostage negotiation. They were actively refusing to provide the one single piece of evidence that actually mattered. Instead, the terrifying demands for millions of dollars in untraceable cryptocurrency bypassed the physical world entirely. The absolute critical turning point in the psychological standoff arrived with chilling clarity as the highly publicized first deadline of February 5th rapidly approached and quietly passed without incident. The profound silence from the anonymous captors became deafening. Special Agent Hythe Janke, who was directly in charge of the massive Phoenix FBI office, publicly confirmed the absolute darkest fears of the investigative team. Despite the aggressive, relentless demands for massive amounts of untraceable digital currency, the unknown individuals operating behind the encrypted email servers completely and repeatedly failed to provide any valid form of proof of life. In the highly dangerous, high-stakes world of violent criminal extortion, a kidnapper absolutely must prove that they actually possess a living, breathing hostage before any massive financial transaction can ever occur. They must provide a current photograph, a short recorded audio clip, or a highly specific newly acquired piece of information directly from the victim. It is the absolute fundamental core of the entire twisted transaction. But the individuals targeting the terrified family offered absolutely nothing but aggressive text and empty digital threats.